on a remote island in the South Pacific.
It seems like they died and everything, and they're like just forgotten.
Milwaukee Marines killed in World War II
She got the telegram, missing in action.
are still waiting to come home.
Both of them are laying in a jungle somewhere, middle of nowhere, and it bothers me.
This week on Open Record, the high-tech search
They can put it into a computer model and essentially wipe away the vegetation.
for a dive bomber and his gunner.
We honored these guys by trying.
Gone,
We as a country, have to bring them home.
but not forgotten. From the Fox 6 studios, this is Open Record. I'm Bryan, and I'm joined here by Open Record's executive producer, Sarah Smith. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
And we are once again joined by Fox 6's Carl Deffenbaugh. Carl, welcome back to
Thanks
Open
for having
Record.
me. Good to
I
be back.
always love when Carl's here because we've got something really good to talk about. We're recording this episode on Wednesday, September 24th, 2025. It's been 82 years since a couple of Marines from Milwaukee and Cudahy were killed during a dive bombing training run on the South Pacific island of Espiritu Santo, known today as Vanuatu. Their remains are believed to be buried somewhere in what is now an island jungle. This week, we'll introduce you to the man who formed the Wisconsin nonprofit that is attempting to find them, and you'll meet a family member of one of those men who is hoping to bring them home. All of that comes after the break.
All right, we are back on Open Record. Carl, we sometimes do stories about the remains of fallen soldiers returned back to Wisconsin, but this story is a little bit different. So can you talk to us about why you started looking into this and how it all came about?
Yeah, in this case, the remains have not made it back to the state, right? And we see those emotional homecomings for those fallen soldiers, for the families finally receiving closure. And instead, with this story, it's two different families who only recently found out that they were connected, who are still seeking that closure. So for me, it actually goes back to a friendship I've struck up over the years with one of our guests who will be joining us later, Jed Henry, who's a photojournalist, originally worked for TV stations like we do around the country, now freelances for the networks, doing things for like Today Show reporters and the like. And on the side, he has this incredible pursuit to find and identify and honor a number of these fallen service members. And as he'll tell us later, this goes back to a connection to his grandfather. But he and I worked together on a story a few years ago, 2022, about a missing soldier from Saukville, it ended up, who was identified and honored in Belgium from the European theater of World War II. Well, he reached out again, going back to the spring. We were having some conversations about this story and a new search that they were going to attempt this time in the Pacific Theater on this faraway island, really on the other side of the world. And in this case, it dealt with two different families from the Milwaukee area, one a Pulaski High School grad, one a Cudahy grad, who had ended up serving together in World War II. They had fought in a number of different battles, were on a training flight back in 1943 when their plane crashed. And at the time, it took a little bit because of how thick the jungle was on this island that you mentioned, Bryan, in the South Pacific. Their bodies were identified eventually a few months later after a number of different searches, and they were buried at the crash site as opposed to brought back to the base and buried there. And I think Jed can explain some of that coming up later on.
I had a question about that, though.
Yeah.
You said their remains were identified by who? Was it by the military?
Members of the
Okay,
military,
okay,
yeah.
all right.
Yeah, some of the other Marines and soldiers stationed on this island at the time. Jed will allude to this, but I believe it is that thick and it was that remote where they crashed that he assumes they were just unable to bring the remains back at the time. But there are documents that he found, military documents from the time, noting that they were buried, that there was actually coordinates to the site of the crash, but then they were never brought back home, even after the war ended. I think that was often the case. When the war was over, they would bring a series of these soldiers back to their families, back stateside, to be buried with honors. In this case, there was a follow-up search a few years later, 1947, but it ultimately proved unsuccessful because, again, this is a remote island, jungle terrain, very thick foliage. The person who led that search team, a member of the military at the time, in his report noted this plane, let alone the bodies, could have been 10 feet away from them and they wouldn't have seen it because of how thick the jungle is. So that was kind of where it was left all of these years. The crash in 1943, an attempt at a search in 1947, and then pretty much nothing for these two families over the decades since then.
So many questions, but one is just the individuals involved here. You have First Lieutenant Walter Eck, who was the pilot, right? So he's a pilot of these dauntless dive bombers.
Yeah.
And you had said in your story he went on like 40 bombing raids,
Yeah.
actually took down 4 Japanese ships. I mean, when you say, did this person see action? He saw action.
He certainly did. I mean, an American war hero, you can say that. And his nephew has the Distinguished Flying Cross that he received for all of that action in the South Pacific. He was, as I mentioned, a member of the Pulaski High School graduating class, went to what is now Whitewater as well, and then enrolled in the U.S. Marines, wanted to be a pilot, was apparently just this kind of good at everything he did, guy, sports, academics, everything like that, clearly successful as a pilot for the U.S. military as well. So he is the kind of lead of these dauntless dive bombers, which from what I gather, this is like a crazy roller coaster of an experience for these pilots, let alone what anyone else kind of goes through in a dogfight. But they are a 2-seater plane. He's in front, and you do this steep drop to then try to bomb ships or other enemy.
While dodging fire and everything else. Right, yeah.
And then even crazier, his gunner, Private First Class Irvin Karatke, who was from Cudahy, is doing all that backwards.
Right.
So the gun faces backwards to try to protect the rear.
So as
of
they're
the plane.
diving, he's what, backwards?
He's like
up?
backwards.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh my gosh!
And as we'll hear
watching
from
the tail
a
or
family member of Karaki, there's an understanding. They had no idea about like G-forces and things like that.
No
back
kidding.
In the day. So imagine what they're
gosh.
going through. Many of this also with an open cockpit too,
Yeah.
because he
I
has
would
to
be
move the gun
surrounded
around.
by vomit.
Yeah.
That's all I know. It would be.
Just, yeah.
But here's what I'm wondering is because you said that these families didn't know about the connection.
Yeah.
They were like, how did that come
Right.
together? These two, you've got the dive bomber, the pilot, and his gunner, and now they're both sort of part of the same search.
Yeah, so we'll try to keep the name straight for you. So the pilot, Walter Eck, has a nephew who still lives in Greenfield, Bruce Bailey, who we featured in the piece. And then the gunner, Irvin Karatke, his actually younger brother, I believe it's half-brother, Bob Likovitz, is still in Cudahy. So those are the kind of 2 men that we featured in the story, the nephew of the pilot, the brother of the gunner, who individually had kind of always wondered, right? Always had questions. Specifically, they both mentioned women in their life. The grandmother of Bruce Bailey, the nephew, so this would have been the pilot's mother, always prominently displayed the Gold Star memorabilia, took part in Veterans and Memorials Day activities, and tried to find answers but never could. For Bob Likovitz, it was his mother, the mother, again, of the tail gunner in this case, who also had tried to seek out answers, reaching out to the military, trying to prompt follow-up searches. So both those men were kind of tasked by these women in their life with keeping the search alive. They were unable to accomplish it during their lives, so leaving this to the next generations to kind of find. And this is again where, so much time has passed, 80 years now at this point. Bob is in his late 80s, has just brief memories that we'll hear from his daughter actually coming up of his brother before he left for war. Bob was like 5 or 6 at the time that he left. And then for Bruce Bailey, the nephew of the pilot, he never met his uncle, but would hear these stories, see these pictures throughout his life.
I don't want to spend too much time before we get to our guests, but I do. One of the things I noticed, you bring up the island Espiritu Santo, which I'd never heard of before, but now Vanuatu. And I looked it up, and you start looking at the absolutely gorgeous part of the world. It's about 1,000 miles east of the Australian coast.
Yeah,
and
Papua New Guinea is a bigger island in the area.
Okay, and it's a little another 700 miles to Fiji. So you go, okay, this is a beautiful part of the world. But my first thought was, why were they there? Well, this was a military base at the time, right? Part of you said Pacific Theater.
And another kind of tragic part of the story is these men had been involved in some of the fierce fighting on Guadalcanal, which was this massive, pivotal, months-long conflict between the American or the Allied forces and the Japanese forces in the South Pacific. Naval battles, air battles, ground battles as well that all played out. And in some of the letters that Bruce Bailey has from his uncle, again, the pilot, Walter Eck, they're describing that they were in the fighting in Guadalcanal and were pulled back to this island for basically rest, a chance to regroup and everything. So his mother was optimistic. Okay, he made it through some of the worst of that fighting, has a chance to kind of take a breath, gather himself. And then 2 weeks later, after she got that letter, is the report that they had died.
And so tragically on a training run.
Yeah.
Something they had done over and over. But you said these were steep dives. And so obviously always a risk there. There's so much more I want to talk about. And we're going to talk more directly to Jed about the search, mission, his nonprofit and all of that. But before we get to our first guest, which is the daughter of, or a granddaughter, right? Or no, I'm sorry.
This would actually be the niece.
The niece. I'm sorry,
yes,
niece of
the
one of the
tail
people. Listen,
gunner.
before we do, I just want to know how. So it's been 82 years.
Yeah.
I imagine we're seeing all of these people who served in Afghanistan and other things much more recent, whose remains are being brought home. Is there a sense here that's like, these? I guess we watch a lot of movies, and in the movies, war movies, people die, and especially the side characters, the people who don't have any names, you just move on. But in real life, it doesn't work that way. 82 years later, I guess it's remarkable to think there's still this search going on right now.
I was so struck by the emotion from Bruce, specifically the nephew of the pilot, but Bob speaking to the unanswered questions as well. How much this has meant to the family, how much it has meant to these men in silence, largely over the years that their family members were not home, and both of them, but Bruce especially, kind of spoke to what so many people have, right? A physical place to go and mourn your loved ones, a place specifically for them being military families. They could go on Memorial Day, they could go on Veterans Day and pay their respects to American heroes who served and protected our freedom. And in this case, they don't have that physical place. They don't have the physical remains of their loved ones. They have photos, they have memorabilia, the medals, things like that, but they don't have the people themselves still to this day. Well,
without further ado, we're going to get to our first guest. It is a very personal issue for the relatives of these two men, and after the break, we're going to introduce you to Kathy Medalley, whose Uncle Irvin was the gunner on that dauntless dive bomber. We'll do that right after this. We are back on Open Record, and we are joined by Kathy Medalley. Her uncle, Irvin Karotke, was a private first class working as a tail gunner in a dauntless dive bomber during World War II until a crash on a training run killed him and his pilot. Kathy, thank you so much for being here on Open Record.
No, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
As I was saying just before the break, it's been 82 years since this happened. I wonder for you, growing up, what did you hear? What kind of stories did you hear? What did you know about your Uncle Irvin?
Yeah, so as far back as I can remember, I recall my dad talking about him, speaking about him, talking about the time he served in the military. One of the key things that stuck in my head was that if anybody ever comes to the house saying that they may have found remains of your uncle, follow up on it. The family has been searching for, as you mentioned, over 80 years for potentially his remains to be identified and brought home. My dad always has the pictures of him hanging in the office, has the medals displayed. So again, this Jed taking us on was really an opportunity for some healing and closure for the family.
How did that all kind of come about? I mean, obviously you guys aren't just sitting around going, oh, I hope they come to the door and let us know.
Yeah.
Like, obviously you guys are active in this search. So how did that, relationship come about with you and Jed?
Yeah, so about a decade ago, and Jed can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was about 2015, my dad had seen a news piece that involved Jed's organization, the Lawrence Gordon Foundation. And my dad reached out to him and said, hey, here's the story of my brother. We've been trying for decades to get someone to go look for him. Never had any luck with anyone taking up the case. I think at that point, Jed, maybe you guys might have responded, but then it went dead for about a decade until either late last year or early this year when Jed reached out to my dad and said, hey, we think we might have enough information to take the case up.
And we'll get to some of the technology as well that gave hope to this mission that was not there in previous years and decades. Tell us, Kathy, about the connection to this other family, too, because that was such a fascinating thing to learn. Both of these families kind of separately going through this pain over the decades without realizing how physically close, geographically close you guys were, and this shared history.
Yeah, no, and that's a really great point. For up until we met Jed, we had thought there was no relatives of the pilot. We were always under the understanding that Walter Eck was an only child. We didn't realize he had a sister, especially a sister or family members that were still in the Milwaukee area. So it was through Jed that we were able to make that connection. And as he pointed out, and Carl, as you mentioned, I mean, 10 miles away from each other all these years, we had no idea.
So that must have given you some hope that, okay, now we're searching together. How has that changed the feelings about your search for your loved ones?
Yeah, and I know Bruce and my father, Robert, were able to meet, and watching some of that video that Jed put together, it's really interesting to know that another family was going through the same things that my dad was going through all these years. The wondering, the questions, the, hey, can we somehow find a way to bring these guys home? Again, we had no idea that the family members were still out there.
One of the things I wonder about, and I don't know if you have the answer to this, but when I told you right before we started, I said whether it had been a mistake I'd made in the introduction. And one of those was referring to them as missing in action, and they may not technically be considered missing in action. I don't know the definition, but obviously there are tens of thousands of American service members who are missing in action. In this case, they were identified and buried at the time, but where their remains are now, no one seems to exactly know. You know they're on that island, but exactly where, very difficult. And you've had all this trouble getting anyone to go look for them until you come across Jed. How do you classify them? Are they missing in action? Are they not? What are they?
So, I mean, I believe by definition, missing in action is they have not been able to identify or locate the remains. What I've heard from my dad is when his mother was originally notified, she was notified by the U.S. government that he was missing in action because they crashed, and they had not located the bodies. Again, this was in January of 1943. I believe once they located the crash site in May of that year and buried the bodies, I believe they are no longer considered missing in action. I think it's unrecoverable, but Jed may be able to speak into that a little bit more.
Carl alluded to it a little bit earlier in the podcast here. Why is it important, and we probably can all go, no kidding, right? But like, why is it important to have your uncle's remains back in Wisconsin?
Yeah, and I think Bruce summarized it perfectly. Having a place to go where you can pay your respect is really a big deal. And I believe it's, the closure that my family and specifically my dad are looking for. Something that was interesting as a part of this whole process is Jed was able to share some of the documentation that related to my uncle over the decades since he passed or was killed in that crash. And what really resonated with me and really put things into perspective were letters over the year that both my grandma and my father wrote, trying to find out any information, trying to get someone to take up the case, looking for any details possible. And up until the 1980s, there's, a letter from my dad reaching out, trying to find more information on it. So again, it's a place where we can go and pay our respects to these brave men.
The other thing that we kind of touched on in the piece as well, Kathy, and you were there for that interview with your father throughout, is a little bit of what the country owes these fallen men as well, that they gave so much, the ultimate sacrifice, right? What do we still owe them to this day to try to bring them home?
Yeah, exactly. And the other piece that sticks with me in this, and, our brave men and women serving today as well, many of them join out of high school. I look back, my uncle was 20, the pilot was 23. The level of responsibility that they had on their shoulders going into this, I can't comprehend, a 23-year-old pilot, the 20-year-old gunner, as you guys were describing, flying backwards, while going into these dives against enemy targets is just something that is difficult for me to even wrap my arms around today.
It's so...
You were the one, actually, Kathy, who pointed out the idea about the G-forces, too, because you've actually gotten to experience modern jets to some degree. Maybe you could share that and what your understanding is of what those men went through in these World War II era planes.
Yeah, it's thanks for bringing that up, and I know you can relate to it, too, Carl. I had the honor and privilege of getting a ride in an F-16 a few years ago. And I have even though I've worked with the military as a defense contractor for over 25 years now, there is a whole new level of respect that I have for pilots. I mean, when I went for the ride, put aside the training that goes along with it, but wearing the flight suit, the G suit, if you're over water, wearing, any sort of flotation device, gloves, now trying to pilot a plane and look at all the sophisticated hardware that's in the cockpit, in addition to dealing with the Gs. And I didn't know what to expect. You hear about G's and how it plays on the body, and they describe, when you start to black out, it's like a tunnel, things start getting darker. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I really buy that, but no, it's no kidding. I think we went up to about 7 G's, and I had the tunnel vision starting where I started to black out, and then the G suit kicked in, and the amount of pressure and force on your body, not only for pulling the G's, but then the the G suit to, kind of get your blood flowing back up to your brain. It's actually almost painful. So the level of respect I have for these guys, it's until you experience it, it's again another one that's really hard to wrap your mind around what they're going through.
And again, that's
now,
a modern
I think about my
warplane.
uncle.
Yeah, go ahead.
Him going backwards and all of this stuff happening.
What strikes me, though, is you mentioned those ages, and it really hits home. I have an 18-year-old,
right.
2 22-year-olds, and a 24-year-old. And to imagine that, I can't get them to do the dishes. Imagine them dive bombing a ship in a war zone it really does drive home the point that these were, I know they were adults, but I think they were kids.
They were kids.
And they're still over there. It is remarkable. I do want to go back though and ask, because I'm curious with regard to their sort of classification, if they've been found and identified, is that part of the challenge? Has that been? Because I know that the Defense Department has a budget for trying to find people who are, or soldiers, service members who are missing in action, because they are not considered missing in action. Has that made it more difficult to find someone willing to go and search for the remains?
And again, I'll let Judd give his perspective. From our perspective, like I said, for decades, my dad and his mother tried engaging to get someone to go look for him and never had any response or anybody willing to take on the case. So that may have played into part of it, is, based on they're not considered missing in action. They're just unrecoverable. That I'm not sure of.
Well, I know we're going to talk to Jed all about that. And we should, for those who are watching and didn't watch the story itself, obviously we're talking about still finding them. They haven't been located.
Right.
Is there still hope for that? Are there still efforts you're hoping can be made to find them?
Yeah, I am still very hopeful that maybe this is the first step in the process of trying to bring them home. As they described in the news piece, it's, really looking for 2 needles in a haystack. I'm hopeful that tips will continue to come into the World War II Museum that's on island in Espiritu Santo, that it will keep flowing up through Jed's organization. I'm hopeful that maybe more solid information on where their remains may be located will lead to another on-site or in-country search activity.
It was interesting talking to you and your father before the search, because there was so much hope and excitement, this new technology that Jed will detail. After the fact, though, the other thing that struck me was your dad just appreciated the effort. That's what it sounded like, that someone cared after all these years, all those letters, no responses, that someone was finally looking.
Yeah. I mean, and it brings tears to his eyes, knowing that someone has cared enough to make the effort, regardless of the outcome. And as the team was leaving, my mom kept saying, whether they find something or not, we just pray for their safe return and, a safe trip while they're in country. It really is about someone just caring enough to put the effort in, regardless of what the outcome is.
Well, Kathy Medali, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Open Record and share your family story and your story of your Uncle Irvin Karotke, the gunner in this dive bomber. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
We talked a lot about Jed, your buddy, and someone who's got quite an interesting mission. The search, in this case, was conducted by a Wisconsin-based nonprofit in Middleton. You're going to meet the man who started the organization about a decade ago while searching for another missing veteran. Jed Henry joins us right after this. We are back on Open Record, and we are joined now by Jed Henry, who is the founder of the PFC Lawrence Gordon Foundation, engaged in this search we've been talking about throughout the podcast. Jed, thank you for being here on the podcast.
Yep.
So obviously, Carl, you've met Jed. You've known Jed going back. So you guys have a little bit of a
we got some beers
relationship going
together
back,
when
right?
the RNC was here in town and he was working. So yeah, he's been a good guy to get to know over the years.
Okay, so this is the thing that gets me, Jed. Carl is he knows you. You guys have the photography background and news background, and then you're telling him about this mission and this organization you have. And I know you were salivating over the stories. You could tell because it's a pretty cool organization. But tell us about how this came about. What is the PFC Lawrence Gordon Foundation? How did it begin?
Well, it all started with the guy Lawrence Gordon who served with my grandfather during World War II. He was one of 44 men out of a group of 200 that was killed during World War II. And when I made it to Europe on my first trip to kind of retrace my grandfather's footsteps in 2011, I learned that he was still missing. And it just kind of bothered me. I had learned a lot about my grandfather's service and the guys that he'd served with. I'd interviewed a number of them. And I don't know, it just stuck with me that Gordon was the only one that was missing. And it just so happened that I met a guy in France who had the file on the missing soldier. And, we started kind of looking at it, and it was like, hey, like there's a chance that maybe we could find this guy. And I thought, wow, the government just must have missed this one. And when I reached out to them, they basically said, oh, hey, that's nice, but we're just really not doing anything on those cases right now. And I thought, well, that's not what I expected to hear. And so maybe we can look into it and find him ourselves. And so it took quite a bit, but we ended up finding him in a German cemetery in France, and we did all of the work ourselves outside of the government. We repeatedly asked them for help over and over and over and over again, and they basically said that they determined back in the 40s that it was a German soldier, and then they said that because he was from Canada, that maybe it wasn't their responsibility, which wasn't the reality, but that's what they told us. And so as I understand it, it was the first case that was ever completed completely outside of the U.S. government's accounting system that had ever happened.
And that, of course, led to what the foundation has turned into. And there have been a number of other searches and cases over the years. Maybe you can speak to some of that, why you think there is some power in doing this outside of the government operation. Bryan alluded to this earlier. There's departments, there's federal funding, everything to go towards some of these searches. And yet some of that can also bog down the actual effectiveness of the searches.
Well, I mean, look, anytime you get into government, there's always a level of bureaucracy. I mean, the agency, and I haven't looked at their budget this year, but I think annually it's roughly about $160 million per year. And we have a roughly 80,000 missing soldiers from World War II to the present. And they have a government mandate that was part of NDAA 2010 that they're supposed to clear 200 cases a year. I think they've met it a few times. I don't know the numbers exactly because I haven't looked over the last few years, but I mean, if you just do the simple math at 200, guys a year at 160 million, you're talking about $800,000 for each identification. I mean, that's a staggering sum of money. And there's an argument to be made that there's no amount of money that's worth bringing these guys home. But in contrast, I mean, the case that we did, the first one we did with Lawrence Gordon, I mean, it was essentially 4 amateurs in our spare time that had no idea what we were doing. And we were able to identify him for $25,000. That came out of my pocket and the family's pocket. So I think there's a lot that can be done. There is a partnership office where they're, using universities and other groups as well. But I think a lot can be done outside of the government.
What strikes me is that if you have 80,000 of these, that the government is going to look at the ones that are going to be what are the highest percentage options here? What are the ones that seem? Let's get the low hanging fruit first. I hate to put it that way. The ones that are going to be the easiest. In this case, you're describing this place in a jungle. I mean, it's overgrown. It's very thick. It's difficult. This is not an easy one. You do have a crash site. You have a location, but it's not easy. Does that make it easier for you outside of government to go, okay, we're going to focus on this and we're going to put everything we've got into this case?
Well, I wouldn't say. I mean, to some degree, I think there's the low-hanging fruit argument, but it's also where they're kind of spending the resources. I mean, the majority of the resources are going into Vietnam cases. which have a low number of missing in relation to World War II. I mean, World War II is about 70,000. I think Korea is roughly 6,000, and Vietnam's about 1,600. And most of the Vietnam sites have been researched multiple times, and so the success rate is low. And so I think that that's still where the vast majority of the funding goes. There's been a lot of push that shouldn't change. I mean, what most people don't realize is that the identifying soldiers and the no man left behind idea was born out of the Vietnam conflict. And so, some of the people in charge of those family groups have said over the years that, the other wars, particularly World War II, should wait behind Vietnam families.
Meanwhile, the family members, of those World War II era victims, though, are not getting any younger, right? We're getting 80 years beyond in this case. For this one specifically, because Kathy alluded to this, that her dad had reached out many years ago when he first saw that report of the Lawrence Gordon discovery. What were you thinking about at the time? What changed over the years to lead you to finally pursue this one of Walter Ack and Irvin Karatke?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those that has always been in the back of my mind. And I don't think, the only thing really that changed is the cost effectiveness of the LiDAR. After I got the files and was able to kind of review this case, I think what was always the most interesting is that it had coordinates. It gave you a starting point. I mean, so often with missing soldiers, they're lost, but the circumstances are really vague. In this particular case, we had some coordinates, and, in some discussions with people, it was like, well, somebody on that island probably knows where that crash is. And, I couldn't find any information or any record that anybody had attempted. And so it seemed like a case that was worth doing. And I think that it was, Kathy's father. I mean, the call and the sort of the urgency and the desire. But when he called 10 years ago, LiDAR was still really in its infancy. And the only way to utilize it was with an aircraft.
Let's go to that, because that's a really interesting part of this whole thing. Yeah. What is LiDAR and how did it play a role here?
So, I mean, when you think about going into a jungle terrain, I mean, if you guys have said before, I mean, it's looking for a needle in a haystack. And I think that's one of the things I said to Bob right away is, hey, look, we're not going to just go over there and go walking around in the middle of a jungle and hope that we're going to be successful. I mean, that just doesn't work. And I always thought a two-pronged approach was the best way to try to talk to local witnesses or civilians or people who may have seen it. And then also to leverage technology. LiDAR is essentially a device that sends laser pulses down into the ground. And then depending on what it hits, it reflects back differently. And then they can take those pictures and those images and basically stitch it together. And then you can filter it to kind of remove the vegetation. And from that, to me, the thought process was, we know they buried them next to the plane. We presume that the plane is probably still there, because if it was too difficult to get the bodies out, the plane's probably still sitting there. And so if you can find the plane, you can find the bodies. And, if this LiDAR technology is good enough to be able to show us, hey, there's an airplane wing or there's something that might be an airplane and give us some leads, I thought the two methods, the high technology and the low technology of just boots on the ground, was the best way to go forward. And, we were lucky enough to work with a company called LiDAR USA out of Alabama. And I just randomly called them out of the blue and said, hey, we've got this case. We're interested. And they said, hey, look, we would be willing to do it at cost. And I'm like, all right, if we have the technology and these guys are willing to do it, let's go. So as soon as they were on board, we started planning to go.
What were some of the other challenges aside from the jungle and the terrain? What were some of the challenges that you guys faced or even anticipated going over there?
Logistics is always a problem. I've never been there. This is halfway around the world. It's hard to get there. It's expensive. There's another language. The vast majority of the people will speak varying amounts of English, but the main language there is called Bislama. And, and I found this in other cases. Anytime you deal with translations, there's always a part that gets lost or not completely comprehended, no matter how well the translator is. And then you also have to factor in, like, how many sources away from the original source you get. So if you're getting it second, third, fourth hand, and then you have a translation problem, everything can kind of get a little bit gummed up and make it a little more difficult. And then the terrain is obviously just, I have never in my life seen things that thick. I mean, it was just plants growing on top of plants on top of plants that I just couldn't imagine having to walk through some of the worst of it.
Well, go ahead. No,
I was going to say, tell us about what your team did find, because there was a series of the LiDAR scans. You did get a number of kind of leads from the people that you talked to and met on that island. What some of the hopeful ones were and where you guys landed ultimately after about a week on the island.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is, the coordinates that were available to us in the file matched up with a practice bombing area, which really made us feel like we were in the right place. The problem is when you translate the coordinates, it technically took us into the ocean, just barely, just on the edge. But from everything I read, sort of the east-west coordinates were a little bit harder to calculate versus the north-south. And those coordinates matched up with an area very close to where the 1947 team looked. And so we felt like we were in a good general area, and to have that kind of starting point was great. But, to utilize the LiDAR to hone in an area, we were able to sort of, the first thing before we got there, we had gotten an email even before we got to the island that said, hey, we had a witness that just told us that as a boy, he played in an airplane, and it happened to be like right in the area where we were planning to look in our primary search area. And, but they did tell us, unfortunately, the plane had been removed and salvaged in the 80s. And I said, well, if the plane's gone, I don't really care, because we're not interested in the plane. The only reason we need the plane is that's the location where the bodies are buried. And so it took us 2 days to kind of sort that out, to get the witness there. His brother came with us the first day, and then we actually got the witness, who was the boy that played in it. And he described it as the body of the airplane, which we would meant to be sort of the fuselage, because he said there was no seat, no steering wheel, no wings. There was some debate towards the end of whether or not it was actually a plane. He said it was, but we found no evidence of any metal, anything that would signify a plane crash. So, coming in, we were thinking, oh, this sounds too easy. And I said to the team right away, I said, these cases are never easy. They're always a roller coaster. Every time you think you're close, it just something either goes wrong or you have to look somewhere. So we were able to rule that site out within a couple of days. And then we started getting leads that all kind of put us in this trajectory of where we thought the airplane would go. And so we started kind of expanding from there. And then over the next few days, we just kept getting leads of people that had found like human remains in places. One lady said that as a kid, they were told that they couldn't play in this cave next to the ocean because there were 2 Americans that were buried in this cave. And, it seemed likely that if somebody had found it, that they could move it there. So we dug that up. We had another semi kind of cave area near the water that we researched, and there was cow bones there. We got a little excited because there were bones on the surface. And then we had one guy who farmed in the area in our primary search area that said he had found bones in 2 different places. And one place we searched, couldn't find anything. The other one, he couldn't relocate that area. So, there was lots of hope. There was lots of opportunities and things to look at. But we knew that there was a chance, and there was a reasonable chance that we weren't going to find anything on this trip. But, after 80 years, you have to try to get memories going. You have to make people know that there's something out there, and let them know that there's actually still a family that cares.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, but I want to ask this. Number 1, do you plan to go back? And number 2, I know you operate on pretty much a shoestring budget here. How important is funding to be able to keep doing this?
We'd like to go back. I think we'll need some leads, or we would look at potentially sending the LiDAR guys to do a larger search area. But some of it just can't be penetrated by LiDAR. Essentially the way LiDAR is if there's no light that reaches the floor, the lasers aren't going to reach the ground. And so if it's in one of those areas, the LiDAR isn't any good to us. But there are lots of crashes there, and so there can be lots of false leads. We'd have to kind of figure out where to go. In terms of funding, yeah, everything's expensive. I mean, the government's getting $160 million a year, and, I mean, they're not getting that many remains. And so it's a difficult thing. I've chosen to do things this way. Fundraising is very, very difficult and time consuming. And I've just found it easier to focus on my work and pay for it out of my pocket when I need to and when I feel that it's worthwhile. Would we love to find some great donors? Sure. But it won't stop us from what we're doing.
If you have anything to wrap this up.
To that point, and people listening are probably saying, wow, that's quite you're doing a lot for not getting a lot in return, I guess, Jed. It started with a personal story with that connection to your grandfather. It's continued to people that you're not related to. Why continue? Why keep the work going?
Because it means something. I mean, and I think especially for missing soldiers, and I've seen this very, very commonly with families that I've talked to, is when a soldier goes missing, it's so painful when they don't have the rituals that we're used to with someone getting dead, with a burial and being able to grieve and all that. And it's almost redundant in the fact that there's always a picture on the wall. And the surviving family members generations down the line always remember that picture was there, but that no one ever talked about that person. And so they lose touch with them. And it's not until you either get into this or work on it or find someone that all of a sudden that the soldier is remembered, and that he becomes a, sort of a central place back in the family. And he's honored in that way by, attempting to find him and remember him.
Well, Jed Henry, thank you so much for your efforts and also for your time here on Open Record. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
We will go off the record right after this. And it is time for us to go off the record. This is the part of the podcast where we get a little more casual and have a little fun by answering a question Sarah has for the two of us. What do you have today?
It is. Now that I'm looking at this, I'm like, I feel like we talked about this, but here we are. We're talking about leftovers.
Ooh.
I
Yes.
hate them.
What? Wow. Why? It's less work.
I don't know. My husband gets so mad because I'll make like a casserole and I eat it one time and he's like, I'm the only one that eats this casserole. He's not wrong. Okay. How many days can or will you eat leftovers? Like in a row?
Ooh. The same thing?
Mm-hmm.
If it's really good, I mean, I could go a few days in a row because what I like is for me, the leftovers become lunch at work.
Fair.
It's work I don't have to do to package and make something and whatever.
Sarah, apparently your relationship is similar to mine with my wife. So
Kim doesn't like those either, huh?
She's like you. Like, make a great meal, maybe take her for lunch, Bryan, the next day, and then it's done. It's on to the next. This is more back in the cheaper days when I was getting into this industry that, as we alluded to, does not maybe have the most money behind it. I would make like a pasta dish or something like that, tuna fish salad at the beginning of the week, and just eat it for like 5 days straight.
That's
same thing. I appreciate a good meal, but that's more when I'm like going out to a restaurant. I could eat the same thing if I like it regularly.
Okay, so let's say you're packing your lunch, and Carl, I only know this because I see you a lot at noon. For after the show, we usually debrief on stuff. You eat the same meal basically every lunch. No, because
wow. Is this shocking?
Intervention?
No, but like Eric, my husband's the same way. He eats the same thing every day at lunch, and I'm more of like I need a variety of something. Like I can't eat the same thing every day.
This probably goes back to like what my mom made in elementary school.
Yes.
It's been a nice sandwich
with
some
nothing
carrots,
on it.
some
It's just
cucumbers
dry.
on the side.
For lunches, I can have the same thing days in a row because it's whatever was left over and it's fine. But if it's dinners and somebody goes, "Hey, should we have pizza tonight?" I go, "I had pizza yesterday." Why couldn't you have it 2 days in a row?
That's
you
what
could, but
I said something
for dinner. I say no.
Yes, well, I said something to Eric because I'm like, well, I don't know. The kids had pizza last night. Eric goes, they would eat pizza every night if you let them.
That's true, right?
I don't know. Maybe they would, but I'm more like I need variety. And then usually he says, "Don't project your thoughts." Anyway, so
So do you bring your lunches? You bring
I do.
So now,
day.
do you intentionally prep for the week and go, "I'm going to have these meals all week"?
I'm gonna eat this boring turkey sandwich.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, Sunday night, make 5 sandwiches.
You
get
do?
them ready to go.
That's brilliant.
And he eats the butts of the bread.
That's really that. No, that's
And he doesn't put mayo on it.
Look,
or mustard. It's dry.
not all of us are made of money over here.
Hang on.
Mayo's so cheap.
I heard you saying it clearly. No, wait, dry sandwich?
A little bit of a catch. I get good lunch meat. So I get like this Cajun turkey that's got a great spice to it as well.
Still dry.
But mayonnaise
If the
to me
meat's
is
good, if the meat's good enough, why do you have to cover it up with something else?
Yeah.
Okay, I understand.
Whatever.
But still, I couldn't do it. Anyway. All right, that's all we have time for. I'm going to take a break. We will wrap things up. It will not be a dry sandwich that we wrap up, but we'll wrap things up like this.
This all feels very targeted.
If you have something you would like us to discuss on Open Record or an issue you think we should investigate for Fox 6 News, send us an email to fox6investigators@fox.com. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you to Carl. Thank you to our guests today and to Dave Machuda, who is behind the scenes right there. We haven't really heard from Dave on whether he
loves mayo.
Same thing.
I don't know if he does.
I don't know. Anyway, he's not going to tell us.
He says,
All right, fine. That's it. With that, I'm Bryan Polcyn, and we'll be back next week.